Most of the time, I don't know my left from my right.
Now, here's the thing about me that's a secret that most people don't know. I'm borderline retarded, and I can't read. These books that you're recommending,
Goethe.
I would pick that up, and I would be like, 10 minutes later, I'd be like, what's my favorite song? The ABCs?
I think we're kind of getting off topic. Can you name 10 books?
Keep going back to me. Can you?
I just said, no, don't change.
No.
10 books.
You're changing the subject, actually.
10 books.
You're changing the
Okay,
subject, actually.
3 books.
Okay. Well, the Game of Thrones series,
It's not a book.
Twilight
I
series.
want the name.
It is a book.
Reading makes you sick, and reading makes you die!
Hello, everyone. Before we get started, how's my audio? Because it was all low last time, according to
You sound great to me.
All right, I'll back up. Kick us off, Prude. That's a good sound.
That's a great sound. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the world's only pro e-literacy podcast and book review, Do You Even Read? With shirts and mugs available down in the links below. I am one of your lovely co-hosts. This is the only Canadian-American cooperation that ever seems to work during the Trump administration. Dimes, how the hell are you?
That's some high energy. We've completely flipped it. I'm coming in. I'm haggard, and I don't mind telling you. My back's all fucked up. I just realized you can do push-ups wrong. I thought that was one of the safe ones, but I fucked that up. I feel old.
I think that just comes with age.
Yeah, it's not that you can do things right, but doing them right, it's all wrong all of a sudden. So now I'm just like, I'm bent over. I'm at a computer doing a podcast, but I'm like, what? So, I'm vampiring off you right now.
I spent all for context. I took a week off. I've had one of the things I really enjoy. Do You Even Read shirt? $20 right there. Go get it. I'm literally going to be in Chicago at the end of the month wearing one of these t-shirts, walking around. I'm hoping to start a conversation with random people as I take public transportation. And hopefully when they see that shirt, it won't be me who gets stabbed. But, it was great. I enjoyed getting all of my Easter stuff half off. It's a great time. Pascha was a week later than Western Easter. So, of course, it's always important to remind everyone that Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death, and upon those in the tombs bestowing life. I hope that you all had a lovely Easter, a great Pascha to everyone who is listening. We're going to continue our coverage of Jürgen Osterhammel's Transformation of the World, the History of the 19th Century. We're going to do this in 3 parts, and we're going to wrap up the month of April here with this book, and then we're going to take a nice, fun, easy one next month with the Transhumanist Temptation. This is what happens when people give you review copies and then you promise to read them. You end up reviewing them on a niche, book review podcast. We're like the podcast from hell, but sober.
We got so many good books coming up for the end. We pretty much have the entire rest of the year blocked in right now, and I don't want to spoil all of them. We got some for them, some for us, of course. But what I'm looking forward to is we're going to get around to reviewing that Lauren Southern autobiography. That's for sure going to happen.
We were talking about what to cover for Do You Even Read Live? We might put that in the feather in the cap as encore bonus material.
There's a book that was recommended. It might have even been from Geo. I can't remember. But it's called Cunt. It's one of the foundational works of feminist theory. And I've never really read any of that stuff. You hear about it all the time. You hear about Andrea Dworkin and others, but I've never really
I've read bits and pieces of the Scum Manifesto from college.
Yeah.
I've not read a lot of feminist literature since I have left higher learning institutions.
People love it when we cover the dumb shit. I love stuff like this. I love Transformation of the World. I love some of the weirder stuff, but you really need to eventually just sit down from a nice crock of shit and have fun with it. And so that's
it's the books like that remind. So I'm also a connoisseur of slop. I love my slop. And one of the things I really enjoy during the Easter season is Peeps. I love those cancerous marshmallow just I love my marshmallow cancer, and so I had a whole bunch of that. And the books like that, they're my peeps. You know, every time that we cover something stupid, every time that we like when we did like how Europe underdeveloped Africa, it's just like this is marshmallowy goodness to me. It's delightful. I want more of it all the time.
You just reminded me of a question.
And then I just give myself cancer every time I read a book.
Well, yeah. I mean, one of the
All right,
great...
honey, what kind of cancer do you want? We got carcinoma or we got pancreatic stage 4?
And it's like, well, I know what the audience wants. Let's go with the pancreatic cancer today, shall we?
There's so few pleasures in life, and one of the rare pleasures is deciding on what type of cancer you're going to get. Most people don't get that. It's going to be lung cancer or it's going to be brain cancer. So I think we chose right. And I wanted to let you know, someone mentioned Foyd slop. Love it. You're Eastern Orthodox, correct?
Yes.
So Easter, do you do the Easter bunny? Do you do the chocolates?
No, we do the eggs. So we have our sort of midnight, liturgy. Really, it's more like nocturnes, matins than the liturgy itself. It's a long ordeal. But the world deserves a better class of slop, and I'm gonna give it to him. So what I want now is I need like the frog PFP or one of the other images I use. I might put that on a shirt. That'll be a good one. No, so like for instance, I mean we have the eggs, which is real nice, and then it's just all kinds of dessert. But because our fasting rules are different than like the Catholic Church, you basically kind of go vegan for 40 days. And then, you break your fast, your Easter basket gets blessed, and then, you're chowing down on whatever meat and cheese that you brought. So I went to a local rancher in my town, and I bought 3 steaks, and my wife and I just sort of chowed down. Whereas my good friend, Twitter
What'd you get for her?
Nothing. Absolutely nothing. No, she made a carrot cake and some other stuff. We went together. But because like it's different now, because like before getting married, like my Easter tradition was every time Prude reads a book, he loses another kidney. Yeah, well, it turns out kidneys are just free when you're reading about Chinese history. So I found the chapter on Chinese history in this section here really interesting. So we'll get into that. It's easy when you have a civil war that lasts like 14 years and like 35 million people died. That's a lot of free kidneys. So don't you worry.
There's almost too many because that drives the price down.
Well, that's why you sell them back.
And people are like getting extra. It's like, does anyone need 4 kidneys? Well, no, but like you might as well.
This is a weird parasocial moment. At one of the conferences I've been to, my friend Charlemagne was like, "Hey, there's a guy looking for you," and I'm like, "Oh, okay, whatever." So this guy walks up to me and he's just like, "Hey, I have more kidneys than you," and I'm like, "Well, that's a weird fucking flex, but go for it." I have 2 that don't work, 1 that's been transplanted, and then he's like, "Yeah, I have 4. 1 that was transplanted that didn't take, 2 that have failed, and then 1 that now finally works." And I'm like, "Fuck, they just don't take him out of you. It's extra baggage."
I'm going to be honest. This is the first time I'm learning this. They don't
take him out. And it was the most disappointing thing ever when I met with my surgeon about all this. It'll be 5 years this June. And so she was like, "Yeah, we don't take him out." Because like prior to all of this, I had this like really strong desire to have the deformed, fucked up kidneys in like a formaldehyde jar that I would put on my like mantle of like a fireplace in my house, just sort of as like a weird conversation starter, but also like my fuck you to life, saying like I lived, bitch. Turns out they don't take him out, and you're just stuck with them, which I think is really tragic. Because it's like all those morbid jokes where it's like, "Oh yeah, I've got the heart of a 20-year-old. It's in my fridge." It's just like I just wanted to do the same thing.
No, I'm about as much of a medical expert as anyone else in the scene, in that I'm pretty sure I know everything. I like to think I don't know everything, but that can't be right. That doesn't sound right. That they can't just leave stuff inside you. That must cause some kind of difficulty. Like anyway, this is just me flabbergasted. Because like if you're putting another one in, you're already in there. Can you just get one right?
Yeah, like while you're in there, can you just take out a couple of extra? Like, I don't,
You're poking around. If you're working on my car and you leave your fucking hat in there, you're gonna go back and get it.
It's the Indiana Jones bit where like they pull the hat out at the last second as they're suturing you up.
Like, I'm taking the entire system to trial right now. This is I tell you, every time I learn something about the medical industry, the more I want to die. I want to get this over with because it's going
You
to
need to be
them
very
eventually.
careful when saying that because your phone is listening in on you. And you just know tomorrow you're going to get an advertisement consultation email for maid services.
Yeah, it's hey, heard you talking about dying. Do you want it? Do you want it? Do you want it? No, like they're just really.
Hey, you were talking about organ transplants last night. You want to die and give your organs away?
Yeah, I know you're talking about organ transplants that you need one, but did you ever think of giving them all to us right now? See, the thing about maid in Canada is that there's no finesse. It would be more dignified if they were bullying me to get my guts and stuff, but it's very desperate and very clumsy. So, like, even
Would you like,
boomers see through it.
please, Mr.
Do you wanna die?
Be
Do you
interested
wanna die
in
right now?
dying?
Do you wanna
Okay,
die?
we're just gonna leave this pamphlet in your mail slot. If you get a little depressed, just my number's right there.
The entire time you're thinking, like, okay, I understand the pharmaceutical stuff. Are you getting paid for this? Who's getting paid? Why is this happening? I don't know where the money's coming from. All I know is you're going to get one less taxpayer. I don't know who benefits from this, other than you just love to see a white man die, which also is like half of our entire political space right now. So if that's just in season, I guess. We got a lot of kidney stuff in the chat right now.
From my understanding, as long as the non-functional ones aren't causing any problems, I prefer to leave them. Yeah, it's true. That's why Randall Shirker. That's what the nice surgeon had explained to me. I'm one of the few people on Earth who have been cut up by women, and I have not died.
Oh man, I bet Gio would have some kind of fucking twisted, perverted comment to say that, like, "Oh, you didn't have to pay for that to get cut up by a woman." That's how like all Gen Z are here.
I just feel like that would be something that would work out in like we covered, oh god, I want to say like 2 years ago we covered like this trio of movies that was more of like an open air therapy session where it was like kind of about fat people. And one of them was this like cartoonist. It was like a Swedish film, and he was just like a pervert kind of character who couldn't get it out of his head, but he couldn't get with anybody. And like towards the end of the film, he's just like, fuck it, I'm just gonna like cut it out, like the literal pruning out kind of deal. He ends up not succeeding clearly, but like that's what you reminded me of. It's like, actually, no, Dimes, we've already done the weird psychosexual trauma airing on that podcast. I don't want to do it again. Not here.
Just based on that description, here I am trying to guess the race that made that movie. Because as you're saying, and I'm like, that sounds like Japan in the 80s, or it could be Scandinavia now. One of the, what people?
Scandinavia now. Like I'm gonna go look it up later because it's like, and it's from like 2 years ago. We've been doing that show for like 3 years and some change. But I don't think people are here to listen to us talk about podcasting or kidney maxing. I think we're here to talk about the transformation of the world.
Yes, we are. So I'm not gonna do a huge recollection of last time, but I wanted to read a couple parts here just to set us up.
Yeah, go for it.
That's okay. So let me just change this up a little bit here. All right. So I just wanted to read this part. It sort of summarizes where we've been, because on the last episode we discussed more.
We were very conceptual, big picture in the first episode, and then there are a lot of I have some notes, I have some sections I want to read where that's far more nitty gritty, but also like there's a conversation that Osterhammel has on like the frontier, and it's just like I've spent a great degree of my time online talking about Frederick Jackson Turner, and he spent some time talking about that. So we'll get into that, but go ahead.
I saw the transplantation of the world.
That would be a great book.
This
and it's just going to be me ranting about immigration. Actually, I stand corrected. The Cultural Transplant by Dr. Garrett Jones. Go read that fucking book if you want to read about transplants and immigration.
If you want to get a book deal in this space, and I'm not going to mention any names, but I've read a couple that came out fairly recently, and I guess there's still an audience for someone coming out saying, "Man, that George Floyd thing was wild," like that happened. America.
See, this is why I have like 3 or 4 fake names in like the barrel with other people I've talked to, where it's just like, it's like, wow, that Harold Silversmith guy, like he's got his thumb on the pulse when it comes to this George Floyd nonsense, and it's just like, that's just gonna be me, that's what we should do. We should be ghostwriters of like disaffected liberals saying the left me. That's where the grift is in the year of our Lord 26, just like it was in the year of our Lord 1996. 2016, 1926. It'll be great.
We're writing for boomers, talking about, hey, remember that thing? Remember COVID? What the what? And we always had this archetype that we were laughing at on the show of the boomer who just started cluing in. It's just like this Archie Bunker.
Adventures of the guy who just started paying attention, yeah.
Just like an Archie Bunker type, like, I think something's going on. And then just like vague posting, just like something, and it's like that we didn't start the fire song, so you can just write a book where it's like, and then abortion's up, and men and women, the women don't make sandwiches anymore. And I remember back in my day, it's just like bog standard bullshit that I don't. Again, we're always asking, who's this for? It's not for me, it's not for us, but I don't know who. I guess it's for women.
So before we get into this, I went to a very large chain bookstore yesterday afternoon. I spent all of my Sunday kind of recovering, and I took today off because I'm physically exhausted and ready to die. But like, I walked in and they had like mainstream chain bookstores like Barnes and Noble and Books A Million in America are absolutely fucking wild depending on where you live. So like I live in a like R plus whatever district, but like I'm also not too far from like a community college. And so it's like kind of bizarre to like walk into like Barnes and Noble and all of a sudden you have to stop putting chat up. I'm gonna like get totally distracted. They should really start paying us if the audience wants to keep going. But no, it's you walk in and it's like, Book Talk made it popular, but now you can support the author. And then it has like, comic book compendiums for what's on television. So like all the Invincible stuff is selling out. But like near the checkout stuff is all the like new age, Wicca shit that, it's like, despite all my rage, I'm just a girl named Paige. It's fine. Like you're burning sage. Okay, fine. We get it.
I bet.
And then there's like 3 rows of Bibles and like Christian fiction and spiritual and devotionals, and none of it is Catholic. It's all like weird types of like Protestantism that I don't know about. Like there's no, like, I'm like, where's the stuff about like the, Methodists or Wesley? And it's just like, well, here's like, dates with God, a 365 daily devotional. It's like, okay, whatever. And then you have like the military, like the world history section and American history, social and psychology stuff. And then there's like current affairs, right? So this is where all your pop books were there. So there was like Right Wing Revolution by Charlie Kirk. Orrin's book, The Total State, was in stock. So was Jeremy Carl's The Unprotected Class. But then it's also like all the boomer lib stuff is all there too. And it's just like, who is this for? I don't know who's buying these books, because like I bought the American Affairs Journal that they put out quarterly, and then I put out I bought That Sickness Unto Death from Soren Kierkegaard, and I was just like, okay, I'm ready to get out of here. Like this is the most schizophrenic, Singapore type of whiplash that you can get in any sort of public space, and that's why we encourage you not to read. That's why we do this show. Don't go to bookstores.
You walk into a bookstore, any large chain bookstore, and deciding it's entirely too horny in there most of the time. Everything's too horny. Even the Christian literature.
Like Sped Kaczynski in chat talking about like they, them, coochie. I mean, that's literally every single person who was running the stand.
Yeah, so it's like our guy got Oren McIntyre, got the rest of them just surrounded by the exact same type of whore who wrote a book. Science fiction, same thing. Everything is just everyone's sucking and fucking, and I don't care for it. You know where I had better luck at outright leftist bookstores, like places where they display.
I feel like I would read far more interesting literature there. And I'm not talking about leftist bookstores where it's like, oh, you know, we're Janny and Janet, and this is our little queer bookstore where you can buy the latest thing about feminism.
Well, that's also just a front to sell cat mittens too. Like it's
also a front for muff divers to meet, you know, in a public place.
Lesbians
that's not
can't do just
that's not
anything
the local
straightforward.
dojo. I mean, really, that's what it's for. No, I mean like an actual like left wing bookstore where like, you know, the guy probably got arrested for like throwing a brick at a cop. Those exist,
and they'll feature
unfortunately.
some political theory up front. Something about Ruth Bader Ginsburg is going to be in there, but they also have a lot of sci-fi reprints. They also have just regular books, which is what you want. The one thing you won't find in there is an autobiography from Kamala Harris. What you won't find in there is one of my favorite books, just as an example of the type of thing that they published. I've mentioned this before, but Bruce Springsteen and Barack Obama had a podcast, and then so they published a book which was transcripts of that podcast. And that's just
that's a grift we need to get in on times. We need to just take transcripts of Do You Even Read? And we can call it, you know, like the books our fathers will never read.
the books of our father's footsteps. Just some dumb shit.
Yeah.
Just some non-thought.
and then we get some like, you know, then we get Mark Levin to write the foreword, and then we're good.
And let me just say this: they had photos in there, Mr. Prudentialist, and what Vanity Fair, black and white, tasteful nudes, photos of like them.
That's safe horny.
Sitting across from each other in a podcast studio, and they thought, no, we have to capture this. And I don't know. This is the stuff that gets $1 million.
That would actually be a fun thing to do, where it's like a fireman style calendar, except it's just like the two biggest chuds you can think of in a podcast studio.
It's just like AI versions of us, and it's all wrong. So the hands are still fucking with 9 fingers.
Wow, that frog has a remarkable 6-pack for not being a human being.
Man, look at this cool buff bullshit.
Oh, look, the AI changed the black guy in Dimes' profile picture to a white guy.
Because good news, AI is bad again, which is better. The better it gets, the worse it gets. I'm going to just read a part here, just to bring people up to speed.
All right, for people listening to the VOD, 2258 is when we actually get into the book.
Yeah. It says, and I'll just going to read a couple of paragraphs here just to get through them. He says, if historians today want to operate meaningfully with the category of modernity, they must guide themselves by theories at the highest level that sociology has to offer. At the same time, they should bear in mind how the 19th century interpreted itself, and they ought to strive for greater spatial and temporal precision than is usually found in social science literature. Sweeping conceptions of the bourgeois subject, functional differentiation, or civil society become serviceable only if it's possible to specify their reference in historical reality. Any attempts to postulate the spontaneous emergence of modernity in the course of the 19th century only remain contentious. The intellectual foundations of modernity were laid in the early modern age in Europe between Montaigne and Bacon and the beginning of Rousseau and Kant towards the end of the period. So in there, and this was near the end of the book, he's trying to explain to you, like, you can't just say, here's when modernity happened. And I think that's when, like, even though, as we're discussing the book, we're going to talk about a variety of technological innovations and new concepts that began to emerge. But if you take this seriously at all, and this is why it's so difficult to bookend where these centuries begin and end. And that's something that almost, and he says this in the book, begins with the 19th century. Because prior to that, you had these periods that took place over many centuries, or sometimes they were very, very small. The idea that we've started to, encapsulate this exact 100 years, and we kind of followed that further the 20th century. That really started in the 19th century because, and we'll get to this in a moment, it's how the century considered itself at the time and how we start to spatialize time itself in a way that we didn't really do before. And if I'm just going to skip ahead here to continuing that thought, page 924. Yeah, here it is. He says, a new era gradually began in the 1760s with multiple political crises throughout the Atlantic space, Britain's colonial implantation in India, and the development of new production techniques. It ended in the course of the 1920s as the manifold consequences of the First World War, some of them positive in East Asia and Latin America, became visible, and movements for national autonomy arose all over the colonial world and other regions held down by the West. Another process with far-reaching implications was the transformation of the Soviet regime from a center of world revolution to a neo-imperialist power. Over vast territory, the most important 19th century current of dissonant ideas, which was socialism, crystallized into a state with no precedent in history, introducing new polarities in world politics and, in the initial period, a new kind of revolutionary ferment. The First World War had disenchanted the West and placed a question mark over its claim to rule over, or at least be guardian of, the rest of humanity. Many global interrelations of the pre-war period had thinned out. So what I like here is that we were discussing the 19th century and the historiography of it, but you really do need to follow it through to the 20th century as well. So there's a fucking motorcycle outside. I know it sounds really cool in a sense, but it's highly frustrating. So just to cap that, I'm going to go back to 234 here just to summarize this here. He says, the 19th century was an age of asymmetrical efficiency growth. An overall gain in efficiency manifested itself in three spheres. First, the productivity of human labor increased in a degree that outstripped growth processes in earlier epochs. Even if statistics cannot meet the challenge of quantification, no one disputes the fact that in 1900, material value creation per capita of the world population was considerably higher than the century before. Per capita income had risen, humanity had become materially richer, and long-term growth, with conjunctural fluctuations oscillating around a steady upward trend, had been achieved for the first time in history. So there's where he's saying what made the 19th century unique, while understanding that the 20th century and what was kind of the conclusion to a lot of these ideas. And I love the idea, like, if there's many things we could say, this is a defining characteristic of this period, but he mentioned it there before, which is socialism. Just like I said, nationalism as we know it now was really developing in that period, even though there was such a thing as a nation, as a people, stretching back to antiquity, of course. But you had this idea of socialism that really came to fruition during the 19th century, and I think the consequences of that, it's like that may very well be the definitive political consequence of that period, and I don't think that's gone away, because revolution, you might say that, oh, we've matured with the revolutionary character that was popularized in that era. I'm like, I guess, but not really. We almost tire of revolution. We're very cynical towards revolution. I don't think anyone really believes in revolution. It's been a commoditized thing, but I think more or less people have accepted socialism as like one of them, even though they don't like to admit it. But so many socialist policies are, like in Canada where I'm at, but also in America, also throughout Europe, and it seems that socialism has also dragged communism towards it, which was what Marx was always afraid of. So I'm like, yeah, that seems to be the legacy of the 19th century, and that might be a big claim, but I'm curious to hear what you think about that.
I think that this is one of the takeaways that Osterhammel has, that it's really important to consider. And again, right, like you have the 30 Years' War, as Jeremy Kearns points out in the chat here, is that this is a gradual but also an organic process. And this is why, as much as Spinal Catastrophism has become a meme for us as a book review show, like there is a point that Moynihan makes that like you can use trauma as sort of a geological, or even with Marvin Minsky, like you have a K line that you can trace in sort of this ideological form of archaeology, and functionally map where these ideas come from. Like you have the 30 Years' War, you have also these emerging crises that come as imperial claims over parts of Europe begin to slow down. And now as you leave the early modern era for what we would call modernity, or what we would just call the modern era, and for a lot of world history trends, all of a sudden, like you're now grappling with, okay, well, if we're not placing the status and social hierarchy on either ethnicity or religion, then what are we reacting to? Well, we're reacting to a radical transformation of the population in regards to capital and capitalism, as sort of the modern context as we know it. And people are going to respond in kind to where now, well, we've unleashed and ushered in the destruction of the ancien regime, and now we're capable of sort of this universal system that perhaps couldn't have been achieved through religious means. So instead, we're going to take that political, we're going to take a political avenue, instead of taking a religious eschatological view. And that can kind of also buy into some of Cudahy's analysis into Marx and socialism and Freud. But at least for what Osterhammel's talking about here too, like you also have the opportunity to where like Europe becomes not I want to say a stable place in terms of, in the continental system, there's not a lot of room to colonize anymore without it being very bloody and very costly. Outside of like the Russian Empire, you're not getting vast swaths of land added to your territory, unlike America or unlike Russia. And there's that Twitter account, Alexander's Cartographer, and he does a lot of great stuff translating these like Russian expeditions into like the middle of nowhere that would later become, the Soviet Socialist republics. And it's really interesting stuff because it doesn't read too differently from a lot of American frontiersmen and sort of anthropology at the time. But for this, I think that socialism is the greatest consequence of the 19th century. I would agree with his analysis, especially on the lens that he's right. Like we birthed an empire, the Soviet Union, that had never really existed before on these principles. I mean, yes, it did obviously change through like Stalinization and various like Brezhnev era reforms and things like that, right? But nevertheless, like you have a supreme Soviet, you have also the new Soviet man, like you have these new interpretations of the self that are functionally and based on antithesis of what came before, which would be like for the Russians, it's orthodoxy as well as like Western bourgeoisie capitalism. And yeah. I think that, for Osterhammer, like this is a very important thing to consider because, if we look at the history of the 20th century, like the 20th century begins when all of these ideas finally get to go into the boxing ring and kind of duke it out. And even like, what is the ultimate reaction to socialism? Well, it's European Italian fascism. And that becomes, a leading ideological style of governance that functionally recreates Europe in its own image and kills millions of people that go up in human smoke because of it.
He had that great line there where he said that it's obvious to many of our listeners, but how disenchanting World War I was. I think you can sort of reflexively make the claim that the 19th century might have been the last period of enchantment. It was the last century where it seemed like the West was propelling itself forward with confidence and optimism.
It was the last time the West believed in its invincibility.
Yeah, and then that World War I and World War II, that just shook it to its core. And I'm not saying it was completely different back then because the seeds were already planted, of course. But we mentioned socialism, but I think there's an interesting summary of that era would be, socialism, the intersection of that, and then also the fall of traditional hierarchy. The ancien regime would be another way of putting it, but what does the ancien regime really mean? And he makes a case.
It just means the last regime, really.
Yeah, really. But it's kind of like the death of, like whether or not you believe that they believe what they're saying, it was sort of that the energy animating it was saying that old world of old hierarchies itself is over. And by saying that, it seemed that people locked into it. They got what was being said. And Osterhammel says here, it says, another feature of the century was the tension between equality and hierarchy. And, that's something you hear about all
Tale
the
as
time.
old as time.
Yeah, but I think this is the one where, the trend towards not just equality as a general concept, but legal equality. This is where that really started. He says in a major textbook, the Swiss historian Jörg Fisch has already described the successive realization of legal equality through the removal of particular areas of discrimination and the emancipation of groups affected by them as one of the central processes in Europe during the second half of the 19th century. The tendency towards legal equality was associated with the rules and patterns of societal stratification that reduced the importance of family origin, making the market more important than ever before in determining social position and possibilities of advancement up the ladder. With the abolition of slavery, the transatlantic part of the West, already less marked by status hierarchies than in the old world, joined the trend towards general equality. So some people would say that, it was America and individualism and individual liberty that triggered this. And I don't think that's the case at all. I think there was, one of the fascinating messages delivered in this book is that, and this is a difficult one to grapple with on our side, but I'll relate it to something that people will understand in just a moment. It's that these phenomena were of global scope, and you can't really trace them back to a patient zero like a virus. So let's talk about the birth rate decline without getting too deep into it. The birth rate decline is being seen throughout the world. That doesn't get brought up a lot, but to different degrees. And you can blame different things for it. Like in South Korea, you would say it's some kind of rampant feminism, but that's not really present in China, which is also going through a birth rate decline. There's credible evidence that India has been vastly overrepresenting its population. Same thing with China. Same thing with a lot of these countries. They're lying about how many people they have. So we bring it up in the West, in the European peoples, but it's hitting everyone everywhere. And what's that about? You can't really say it's American liberalism being exported or American imperialism, anything like that, because even the strongest opponents to America, you're seeing this in the Muslim world. You don't see that in refugees in welfare states, of course, but throughout most of the world you actually are seeing a birth rate decline, and the phenomena that influence that, it's overlapping causes for that. Part of it's technological, part of it's environmental and chemical, plastic in your blood, birth control in the water, all kinds of shit going on. It's also cultural. Yes, it's also feminism. It's like 20 different things that are causing it. But that model, or that description rather, conflicts with the model that people have, which is that it's some evil empire causing it. Of course, it's all contributing, but to avert course on that, it's not just taking out one country or changing one regime or introducing a new type of government or something. It's like, you understand that when you're talking about a population collapse like that, it's you need to fix 20 to 25 different things. What it might just be is a genetic bottleneck. Anyway, point being that when he's talking about these social trends and using the 19th century as his stage, you're seeing the development of all these similar ideas throughout Japan and China and the Middle East and the Ottoman Empire and stuff. And they were emergent in different contexts. But just like the Industrial Revolution, which we'll get to in just a moment, the Industrial Revolution started in Europe, obviously, we know that. But then it wasn't due to imperialist pressure that the Industrial Revolution spread. It was enthusiastically adopted in different contexts in different nations, and some took to it better than others. But anyway, that's just a long-winded way of saying that. It presents a different model of these huge global social forces that can't just be placed at the feet of a bad guy. What do you think about that?
I agree, but also I think the other important thing to consider is that, and we said this in the last episode too, is you can't really tell the history of the 19th century without discussing primarily the history of Europe. And so I've always said I really don't like a lot of univariate analysis because it usually gets really reductionist, and even someone in chat had said, like you can't look at some of these things and not look at, say, the impact of like the 30 Years' War or the Reformation or the Black Death. Like, there's all these sort of like large, big sort of, again, catastrophism is sort of a model of political analysis or historiography, because like now all of a sudden, you can't just say it's easy to blame, one thing and to go from it. Like, because obviously there are greater contributing factors to it. Like USAID is a really good example of this and what the Doge guys had uncovered and found out. And it's also the same thing that like, well, a lot of places probably overestimate global population, especially in like Africa or India, where like, like the World Health Organization may give them more money based upon, their population count. So of course that number is probably going to be inflated. But then even with what Osterhammel talks about in this section, but also even towards the beginning of the book, is just that we also have to consider, what may have been a revolutionary ideal back then may have either been seen as moderate, a return to some kind of older social teaching or tradition. And for some groups, you're absolutely right, it's entirely revolutionary. But also in the sense that, this is, for even the various European powers, both Protestant and Catholic in Western Europe, it's just, we have also the thing to consider, especially in the way that we're sort of discussing it right now, is that there is sort of this like understanding that like we're going to bring the world into a better place, because there is pride in ourselves that you don't really get to have anywhere else in the world, because it's just like, well, there is no other part in the world that has this kind of level of quality. And in fact, that's a section I was reading earlier today that I wanted to cover, which is a whole section on living standards. And in fact, I'm going to just read this quick section here, because it's discussing on China, but it's really discussing about like reforms, because you have this form of global perception that I think is really important. And let me make sure I have the right chapter up so we can get into it, because to me, I think one of the things that you can't really get around or at all sort of ignore is the perception of how you're going to be looked at by other powers. So like we have, of course, like spatial perception when it comes to like government, but also we have to look at ourselves in regards to how are we going to be viewed by other powers. And I think that becomes sort of the really big part of trying to like the rest of the world catching up, because the second part of this book, it's really broken down into 3 parts. Approaches, which is sort of methodology, like any other historical text. There's going to be a lot of reflexivity and sort of reference to the literature, but also you have then the panoramas. And this is where he does a really good job at sort of breaking down how we're going to look at ourselves and how people look at themselves. So for instance, in the section called the state, I'm on 644 on the PDF page, 625 in the book itself. This is called Self-Strengthening. It's the politics of the peripheral defensive. And I'm going to get to the section here that I really wanted to read. And so it's going to be the next page, 626. And this is a section on the 19th century that I think is really important. And it's going to be the 19th century brought something new, and I'll read it here. The 19th century brought something new. Western European civilization became a model for large parts of the world. Western Europe meant first and foremost Great Britain, which by 1815 was being spoken of in nearly everywhere as the richest and most powerful country in the world. Despite the fall of Napoleon and continuing political instability, France also counted as part of this Western European model. It was gradually joined by Prussia, although it took many decades to shake off an image as a Spartan military state on the eastern fringes of civilization, whose greatest king, disdainful of German literature and preferred to speak French, felt ill at ease there. Outside of the European core, nothing shaped the evolution of the state in the 19th century as much as the efforts of power elites to counter the dynamic of the West by preventatively adopting elements of its culture. Around 1700, Tsar Peter the Great had already pursued a policy of making Russia internally and externally strong, both with and against Western Europe. A century later, the resistance to Napoleonic France triggered the first moves towards a defensive modernization
modernization. The Ottoman Empire had already made a similar start under Sultan Selim III, 1789 to 1807, shocked by Russia's southward expansion under Catherine II and Bonaparte's invasion of Egypt in 1798, but his reforms ran up against a strong internal opposition and made little progress. Less controversial, therefore more successful, was the post-1806 reforms of the army, civil service, justice, and education in Prussia. The construction of a military state under Muhammad Ali in Egypt, begun exactly the same period, is another facet of this moment in world history. The success of military expansion in Egypt revealed the weakness of the Ottoman Empire. And in fact, this is where you get the phrase the Eastern Question, or the Ottoman Empire being considered the sick man of Europe. The fact that the great powers had to rush to its aid against its own vassal, and that Greece came under their protection, was actually wrested from the empire, helped to push the Sultan and leading statesmen in 1839 towards a bold policy of sweeping reforms, known as the Tanzimat, which lasted about 25 years. The fruits were the creation of an educational system, the suppression of some Islamic elements, i.e. secularization, the reforms of state administration, legal changes tending towards a single citizenship, gradual alleviation of discrimination against non-Muslims, and a fiscal restructuring to replace one-off raids and tax farming. The figures leading this drive in the Sublime Porte knew the West from personal experience and formed ideas of their own about the goal, scale, and feasibility of a partial westernization under Ottoman conditions. And I think that's a particularly big part here. And then later on with reforms, we get into looking in places like China and in Russia as well. These sort of reform periods don't just stay in the periphery of Europe as well. This also happens in places like in Mexico. What we get later on is the sort of Mexican Revolution. Of course, you get Porfirio Diaz and others like him. And it's just kind of showing the greater sense of, well, these are the most powerful people on earth. How do we defend ourselves? And so we get defensive realism happening in real time in the 19th century, wherein you're raising interesting questions about, well, who is going to be hierarchy? Who is it going to be? Is it going to be clerics? Is it going to be the church? Is it instead going to be this hereditary system that we've been operating under? Or are we instead going to try and expand upon civil reforms and move forward from there? And how he concludes towards the end of this section here is, and not just in civil societies of the West, there's no idea of a simple government or a simple state. Now we're having, these political machinations take place everywhere. We see the rise of political syndicates, labor unions, lobbies, interest groups, desacralized churches, Christian Democrats. And of course, now with, the printing press, we now have this ability to where we can reify our own little sort of empires of information that are explicitly predicated in presupposition towards a specific political goal and end, so the Daily Worker and, other sort of internationalist sort of understandings with socialism, but also for labor unions or for what is it considered to be a Christian Democrat or things like that. For instance, even today, a lot of this stuff still exists in the modern NGO space that, still takes advantage of these old sort of Western colonial infrastructure. A really good example is an NGO called Movendi International. Movendi International's whole premise is to reshape Western as actually just global health policy towards the proliferation, sale, and consumption of alcohol. And while this is based in Stockholm, if memory serves, the whole organization is based off of the old bones and skeletal structure of the International Order of Good Templars, which was an early temperance movement associated with one of the Great Awakenings here in the United States. And so it really just kind of goes to show that, nations will react to the intensification of the growth of the state. And also that, the 19th century is, we develop as Westerners, as Europeans and descendants of Europeans. The rest of the world, too, has to react to that because fundamentally the greatest empires of the world come from one section in the 19th century. And the rest of the world is trying to orient itself, really re-Occident itself and to re-Western itself as a reaction to how can we have these things with Chinese characteristics? How do we have these strong civil societies that will allow us to have effective bureaucrats and diplomats that can respond to the international pressures of, say, the British Empire or the Germans, or the growing development of a sort of westernized Russia. I think these are very important things to consider, because yes, these things are European, but also at the same time, the rest of the world has to react, because you have the whole century of humiliation, but also the usage of desacralized churches, or even just having churches in the first place to use Christianity as a tool to get themselves in. And again, as we mentioned earlier, it's like the European understanding of self still has the confidence and pride that actually it feels very confident in its ability to not make the world a better place in its own image, but it can just look at itself in a mirror and understand that despite its problems, we're not the land that's being stalked by hunger.
Yeah, you could see as hierarchy is beginning to be dissolved, and as it's beginning to be replaced with equality, the West, Europe, and let's say the Anglo world specifically, they lose the mandate to fix the rest of the world, right? Because someone had made a good point here that just like with socialism is just the inevitable consequence of liberalism. It's just the political orientation of that. Like, why wouldn't this set of policies be the natural endpoint to equality, right? So if you believe that everyone is equal, then you actually you can't see them as lesser and in need of fixing. So what right do you have? And for a while they could. For a while they could believe that they had all these great ideas and we must educate the unwashed brown masses. But it didn't take long for them to say, well, what's wrong with being an unwashed brown mass, right? And then here we are. Now it's all relative. Now no one knows anything. But
it's also what we had discussed when we had covered the hour of decision is that, like, yes, these ideas emerge from Europe, but then also these ideas are integrated with the respective ethnic characteristics of the colonial, vassal states. And what do those what does that look like in that regard? And so, I mean, like, yeah, like you could call these like the non-Western revolutions, or as he had said, like the colored revolutions of the world. But it's like those ideas originally come from here. And it's just like now that they're being integrated, like socialism especially, because almost every sort of like African nationalist project or decolonialization project uses explicitly socialist language. Are they socialists? Yeah, maybe. But are they more along the lines of, we really want revenge on a tribal and ethnic basis? Well, that's clear as day. And I think that that's something that you see there. And also when you come to like the discussion about like a people or the people, this is where you sort of get like the whole question of like, well, where does democracy have its limits, or where is its logical conclusion? Because Osterhammel writes here, and this is in 632, 651 on the PDF. He says the idea of democracy, whether direct in Rousseau's sense or within the indirect British tradition, envisaged a simplification of political mechanisms. Jeremy Bentham, the English Enlightenment thinker with a utilitarian leaning, expressed this perhaps more clearly than anyone else, but a basic point in all democratic programs was that accountable rule in the modern world required the elimination of intermediate powers. The people and those who governed them were face to face directly as possible. Really, in a large sense, the abolition of civil society. The link between them was to be as a form of representation, either democratic through procedures of election and delegation, or a unio mystica in which a monarch or dictator claimed to embody the nation, and the people endorsed this claim by acclamation or just supported it virtually. In principle, therefore, the political system of nation states rests on a national homogeneity and the simplicity of constitutional mechanisms. National homogeneity. Nation states or modernizing empires strive for discursive simplification insofar as they establish and seek to realize norms for the model citizen. In many civilizations, pre-modern debates on politics circled around the capacities, virtues, and devoutness of the model ruler. Modern debates center around the ideal citizen, defined in the highly diverse ways, but always expected to find a balance between the pursuit of private interests and service to the nation as a whole. Musings about national identity and civilized behaviors, about how a Briton or a Frenchman, Chinese or Egyptian should comport him or herself, or what it meant to be British or French, Chinese or Egyptian, were a feature of public life in many countries around the turn of the century, yet did not reach the collective excesses of the 20th century, when traitors to the fatherland, class enemies, and racial minorities would be condemned to physical exclusion and persecution. I don't know if that's like... I mean, that existed in the past. I mean, we literally had exile, but I mean, this is also just due to the reactions to the 19th century as the 20th century. Nevertheless, the uniform simplicity of the nations and national organisms remained an illusion. Empires could not conjure away their multinational character, and none took the radical step of introducing a single colorblind citizenship. Oh, they did after 1945. I'll tell you what. Whenever they attempted to create a common national foundation, they soon ran up against the contradictions that were part of their very essence, and colonial systems, political hierarchies could not fail to be complex. It was nearly always the case that many tasks relating to the order and sovereignty had to be delegated. You see this especially in racialized systems like the encomienda system. This also meant that colonial governments sometimes had to make others responsible for providing their funding. In a number of Southeast Asian colonies, compact Chinese minorities organized into a gongxi, or lectures of secret societies, or leagues of secret societies, helped out accordingly in their role as collective tax farmers and monopolists, i.e. in the opium trade. The gongxi were not part of a formal system of rule, yet the state was not capable of functioning without them. Thus, even in a situation where democratic participation meant nothing, the organized interests of recent creation might make themselves felt. In the civil societies of the West, too, the ideal of simple government in a small state kept evaporating. New kinds of bodies proliferated, people, old estates, labor unions, syndicalists, all manners of lobbies, interest groups, desacralized churches, as we read earlier. And I think that this part is really important because now we've transitioned from the hierarchy, as you were talking about, Dimes, to the masses. And the 19th century really does become the politics of the masses, because we have to take a look at, for instance, one of the books I do want us to cover eventually this year. I know we've kind of booked out the next 6 months, but still, Jack Gold, I think it's Glad or Goldstone. It's Revolution and Rebellion in the Early Modern Era, and he focuses heavily on population and demographics as the catalysts for revolutions, and he even has mathematical formulas for it. Myself and Zoomer Schopenhauer covered the French Revolution section in that book a while back. And it's really impressive to look at how you have a burgeoning civil society class of lawyers, a significantly reduced infant mortality birth rate, and people are living longer as the material conditions of the population improve. You have a famine, and then poor management from the monarchy, especially over the scarcity of titles of nobility and how those land titles are being diluted in power and the size and scope of wealth and land. And that acts as sort of the material catalyst for this sort of very class-oriented revolution against the church and against the monarchy. And I think that that's a big part of really what Osterhammel is also getting at here, as well, is that when you attempt to create a greater understanding of a sense of self and you don't have an effective answer to, say, religion, class, race, geography, then your attempt at making an ideal be the modus operandi for a nation inevitably gets bloody very quickly. And we saw this with socialist revolutions. We saw this in 1848. We saw this later in the 1870s in the Wars of Unification. And of course, the catalyst for all that in the First World War, the Soviet Revolution, and its reaction in fascism.
What's so ironic is that, let me just call attention to a comment here that
Sure.
I've been wanting to say for a while, and this might very well be true, from Big Ben. He says, Gauss, Riemann, and Boltzmann are not mentioned anywhere in this book. How the fuck are we taking this slop seriously? I'm not familiar with those authors. That very well may be the case. I want to allow some dissenting opinions in here. He also says, does this author have some axe to grind with Germany? And someone else had mentioned this before I got to, but
yes, he does.
Is German. So if you know Germans, of course they have an axe to grind with Germany and other Germans.
This book came heavily recommended to us by a different set of book reviewers, but also that this text and this understanding of history is heavily appreciated by the Angela Merkel Eurocrat types. And I think that by covering this, you're kind of understanding the modern zeitgeist of bureaucratic understandings of the 19th century. Because if you are a liberal, and I mean that in the like EU model sense, or a globalist, or even an American liberal, you're going to be looking at the proliferation of ideas that come out of Europe and be very quick to denigrate yourself. And again, as what Dime said, this no longer belief in oneself that, oh yeah, like this is how it's going to be. And we can trace these sort of lines. I don't really agree with everything in this book. I have a lot to chew out later when we get to colonialism, but this is sort of why we're doing this. But we do have we have more history books to cover this year. Don't worry.
Yeah, and one thing that you touched on there that I would just like to underscore here was, the real, I guess you call it, irony of the era is that, let's say that it's the century that really tries to understand itself as it's occurring. And we'll get to this later when we get into, the burgeoning area of statistics and census data. Of course, there were censuses before, but we became obsessed with statistics. One thing that he talks about is how, we were trying to, as we were understanding ourselves, we abandoned sort of the models that we were also using at the time, by which I mean, the idea, you said something there that historically a lot of attention was paid to what makes the perfect ruler, and then switched to what makes the perfect citizen, which we didn't talk that much about. That wasn't and
that language is used all over in today's sort of like democratic, literati is, well, what is a model citizenry, or what is the model electorate? What is the right of the duty of the citizen? Even in America, we have this, right? Like, what makes a good American citizen? Well, it's like, oh, it's these ideals, and it's, putting, your neighbor and before you, and it's also, voting and showing up, and the my fucking Norman Rockwell, man. And it's just like, okay, but what, that like, for a lot of people, that's empty platitudes, and a lot of people don't go to their fucking, meetings anymore because, well, again, Putnam and everyone else and their mother and this chat's gonna know it. It's just that, like, and even Osterhammel talks about that. This really only works with national homogeneity. And when you decide to disrupt that or try to eliminate and flatten those differences, to a large degree, this is what Marx, as well as a lot of paleoconservative writers have discussed, is that by attempting to flatten or level it out, even Kierkegaard writes about this, like functionally you try to create just like a big beige blob that has no real characteristics other than what it's told. And you get a Grey Goose scenario where everyone is a gay pride paperclip.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that, as I was saying, that the great irony is that as we were discussing this idea of the people or the masses against power, we are already exiting that frame of mind because we were already so aware of ourselves. We understood that there's no such thing as the people. That's a very reductive way of looking at it. We were getting an understanding, especially if we live in a multicultural society, that we're not all the same. That was very much a Marxist mythologization, and the idea that you as a white man have more in common with a black nationalist than like a rich white person. That really was, being pushed at that time. But even it's something that I don't think even people believed. Not really, but it was something that we talked about. But that self-awareness and that relentless study of ourselves already has becoming aware of the hidden hierarchies of things, and that's what's so interesting to the side, which is that we, as you saw the rise of this sort of atomizing individuality, of course, you saw also a rise of scientific racism during this period too, and it was suppressed, and it continues to be suppressed, but the data was there. Like we were finding the hierarchies beneath it all, right? Even if we were trying to dispose of the Ancien regime, we were discovering the new and exciting hierarchies of nature, of human peoples, of whatever might be. So we were subdividing, we were not conglomerating. If anything, we would have been more conglomerated in the past, but we also weren't inhabiting multicultural societies usually. So it was this sort of conflagration of all these different things. But and so when we talk about an Angela Merkel and many others who read this book, I do wonder if they took the same message that you or I might. Because to me, I read all this, And I don't see a grand unifying vision of the world. And maybe that's what separates maybe some of the Eurocrats from the rest of the world. Like maybe they are that, you know, nefarious. Maybe like they know all this and they're putting on an act. But like to me, you read this book and it's sort of like the downfall of this idea of, you know, this we can, like socialism as such. Like socialism needed to become a contraption just to make itself going, right? But it's not what it was intended to be at the start. Everything's a compromise within a compromise, and it's just by the end of it, you're in this like disenchanted survival state. But this was the last era where anyone fucking believed in anything. And guess what? They were more racist back then. And guess what? They were more attuned to hierarchies. They were trying to get away from hierarchies because they were familiar with it. We are no longer really familiar with it, and so we glamorize it, which is sort of the inverted state of being. Anyway, so I'm just getting some comments right here. Oh yeah, so Big Ben said Goldstone's book isn't bad. Again, I've never really heard of these authors before. Have you heard of any of the people he's mentioning here?
I think it's who did he mention at the beginning? Reisman, I'm familiar with. The rest, not so much.
So one thing we get to, and again, we're spending so much time on other stuff, but we didn't get to maybe the most important part here. I believe it's page 6. Do I have this right? 660. Let's make sure. We're going to talk about the Industrial Revolution and how can we have gotten this far without discussing the importance of the Industrial Revolution. He's got a few things here and I'm starting with this. Believe it or not, I'm just starting with most of my notes right now. Before that was just the introduction. But I think so much ties back to this, and I'm saying things that everyone understands. He says here, the Industrial Revolution happened in England. Only there did the conditions permitting a new level of economic performance come together in a particular combination. The key factors that played a role in this can be easily enumerated. A large national economic territory without tariff divisions, internal peace since the middle of the 17th century, favorable geographic conditions for transportation, especially along the coasts, and a few other reasons. Now, you'll understand that for people like us, we would say also it would be the English people. You know, there's all of those combined and overlap to say this is a distinct people who did this thing. Like I'm not advocating the guns, germs, and steel view of history, which is it all comes back to just the luck of where you were born, as if luck has anything to fucking do with that. Like you're talking about, it's got a large economic territory without tariff divisions, as if that's not something that was chosen. Or it's like there's actually a lot of roads. Who built the fucking roads? They still don't build roads around Africa. Like at a certain point, you're trying to get around just saying that it's something that came from, let's say, the Anglo mind. He has to dance around every other thing. But just to build on that, going to 690 here. He says, and this is interesting, and I never considered this before, but along with the Industrial Revolution, the idea of a, quote, regular job appeared in the 19th century. Much work had been irregular work. Work usually follows a standard pattern within the framework of labor processes. These processes are social in nature. Most include direct cooperation with other people. Certain kinds of worker and labor processes typify a certain level of social hierarchy. If standardized labor processes are combined with a consciousness defined primarily by work, the result isn't, quote, occupation. In the West, work became both a high value and a favored category in the description that people gave of themselves, while idleness ceased to be a desirable norm even among the elites. Queens let themselves be seen in public with their knitting. In economic theory, as in certain currents of anthropology, homo faber became the mandatory model. Classical political economy explained creativity and physical effort as the source of value creation, a doctrine that also became the axiom of socialism and fueled demands for workers to be paid and treated well. Others went further, trying to conceive of work as the purification of humanity. Alienated and exploited labor under capitalism was transformed into a utopia of emancipated labor. That's such an interesting idea that you see communism, Marxism as a reaction to this earlier development, which is the conceptualization of like an occupation as such. And of course, previously you might have been a farmer, or you would have had, because they had guilds, of course, right? But I have to believe that these guilds did function differently than just a job, as a title, as something like you get hired to do it. Your occupation was probably passed down from your father, or the land was passed down to you, but in the 19th century, you have this like a 9 to 5. This is the time you work, and then you get labor unions that get birthed from that. But I don't know, the idea of like an occupation, not like before, like your job would have been your entire being. Like I'm a blacksmith, that's what I am. But here, an occupation kind of becomes something you can adopt. It almost becomes like fashion. Maybe there's like a performative angle to it, but it's also like something you do, like segmented from the rest of you. The rest of your life, or the rest of your identity. Like even the word occupation is an interesting word, isn't it? Like, would you historically say, like, if you're a farmer, is that really your occupation? No, it's something more integral to you. But this is this other thing, almost like a hobby or something that's elective. But what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, he kind of goes into it in the book, sort of the separation between public life and in private life, but also that I think for a lot of this time frame, like you have you've transitioned from a society that, of course, heavily is either feudalized, or like there is not a lot of room for political space for you to be seen as anything but peasantry or farmer or the masses. But of course, we have the Industrial Revolution. It's coupled with sort of this emerging medical scene in space, and again, mainly in 3 places, primarily in England, America, and of course the Netherlands. You do not get the medical advances in like anesthesia in the world and germ theory outside of those like 3 places being debated, discussed, and tested. Yes, there are other scientists as well, but like especially with like the race for a good anesthetic, those 3 places especially. But also when it comes to what's being discussed here, like, yeah, we get a transformation into where like now we have to compete, we have to react, and we have to see ourselves as a good model in comparison to, say, the British or the Germans, and we'll react accordingly. And it's something that we get to see get played out in real time. I mean, we see this eventually. We mentioned Jutland in the first episode too, this sort of race to compete and make more steel than the others. But I think too also, and he gets into it later in the chapter, is that it radically transforms our understanding of citizenry. And if we're not being good, productive citizens, then your relationship to the state is heavily damaged. If you're not being now that you have all this extra time and you can engage in the system a little more effectively through the specialization and the greater techniques, both social and political, of how society functions and operates, then like, yeah, like you just want to be that, like you don't want things to get better. And again, it has a lot to do with, I think, there's this new wave of political idealization that gives people reason to participate. Because they believe that they can actually, change things for themselves and their children, which for a lot of people they may do, but also, back then, like it would be easier for you to be a political player than say now, because you're right, anyone can be a podcaster today, but like, there's not a lot of guys that are going to go out and like, bomb the foreman's house or anything like that, or be militaristic, right? Because of course the state is far more complex. But back then, like, I really don't want to, I won't even mention it. I will just mention the concept. There was far more political potential energy back then than there is today, in the sense that your ability to be engaged politically is certainly way different now than it is then. And things were, there was dynamism, whereas now it's, a lot of it is paid actors, and you have to be specializing in this since like middle school and working with groups and hoping that you'll get into a good school to be a political leader. And of course, there are some modern day counterfactuals to that, of course, but I think that that's something that's kind of important here to look at is that your occupation no longer explicitly defines you, but at the same time it still does, because we haven't really liberated ourselves from like the understanding of serfdom, as well as like what does it mean to be a peasant in this society that claims to have these like political ideals. And so all these internal contradictions get played out in real time, and I think that becomes a really, especially for what Osterhammel is doing in this book, which is providing a sort of just like very Eurocentric understanding of the world in a way that I think that it would be quote unquote required reading, in the same way that certain political science textbooks are required reading in America. And you definitely see him play that out, or in the sense that, well, this is how we got to here, and this is how you need to understand that what we're doing now is just a natural conclusion of these ideas. And if you're a believer, like a good Democrat, then you're going to be fine. And this is the right thing to do. Even though, like Weber gets mentioned, but he's like not really cited unless he's being criticized or just, offering different interpretations. And so like there's a lot that gets deliberately left out. And I think that it's important when we read this, because it's like there are other ways to read the 19th century, but for this text, like this is the European transformation of the world, and then the consequences of the rest of the world catching up. And that's a big centerfold theme here. And of course, the Industrial Revolution is front and center and all that, because you don't get the birth of everything else without life getting easier and the ability to make things en masse change.
And you started off with discussing your interest in the frontier or the periphery, almost as a fundamental concept. And that's kind of what the story here.
Mainly because I'm an American. Like that is a fundamental national mythological concept to us. And I mean, it inspires both, the liberal and the conservative. It inspires everyone, even to a point where, even atheist Redditors and like vitalists on Twitter can be like, going to the moon is based for totally different reasons.
Yeah, but what's interesting is that this is really what you were just saying. Like that's the sort of the 19th century, which was, the Industrial Revolution started in England.
Yeah,
as a consequence of the English people, and as it spread, you see sort of frontier theory manifest, because this is also what happens with empire. As you expand into the periphery, you absorb the periphery. You actually lose control, and there's this. Who would have said it? Harold Innis, I think.
Well, this is also a point that, like, I mentioned the cultural transplant earlier by Garrett Jones, and like his whole book is just talking about like when you try and bring these people in, i.e., like vassal populations, or just like unfettered immigration from like Mexico or Guatemala or whatever. The people who come here become less Guatemalan and become quote unquote more American. Like they'll watch your shows, they'll eat your hot chips or whatever. They'll enjoy some of the like material aspects, but also because you brought them here, your country becomes less, American or less German or less English, or, insert country here, less Canadian.
Well, it's like, I think it was Harold Innis who was talking about this, about the English language, that as it began to conquer the world, so too was it indigenized. And that was the word he used, that as these other cultures adopt English, that feeds back towards the center. And so English as such becomes sort of Africanized, indigenized, becomes weirder because it's technically absorbing more people. And so just like the Industrial Revolution was a product of the Anglo mind, so did it spread, but then was adopted in different ways. And all of this sort of fed back into that center of power. And that's sort of that's the nature of empire. That's the nature of civilization that expands. And, the second thing I wanted to mention was, the story of the 19th century what's interesting there, listening to you describe it, it's like the story of separation. And there's a couple comments here that address what I'm about to talk about. We've got Penultimo 777 who says, I find it hard to believe that people did not identify with their work in previous eras, TBH. And that's kind of where I was, as I'm reading this again now, it really jumped to the forefront of my mind. I'm like, I keep coming back to the fact that we had guilds in Germany. All throughout Europe, we had guilds since time immemorial, in a sense. These sort of, I wouldn't even call them labor
guilds
movements.
as well as religious orders.
Yeah, so I'm like, there's an understanding of it. You had trades, you had labor, and these trade categories, and people would have identified intensely with being a farmer or a blacksmith or a cobbler or whatever, right? Even in the peasant world, So I'm like, I'm trying to reconcile that. But then there's another comment here that was interesting. Vulpus Persona says, if you worked in a lime kiln or made charcoal before industrialization, it was a seasonal thing, so maybe less salient to the identity. So there's a couple of good points there, and I'm like, that is true, because you'll read that people used to work less. They didn't work 12-hour days doing this. Maybe they were very seasonal, but I keep coming back to, well, they had to identify with it, which is just to say that the book making the point that the idea of a regular job, I'm like, okay, let's read. Maybe I'm trying to steel man this position too much. Like, what does he mean by regular job? It's almost the way I interpreted it, and maybe this isn't how it was intended, but it's like it's a story of separation, just like citizenship. He said that just not long ago, which is like previously throughout history, you were the subject of a monarchical domain, or there's more of a sense of blood and soil, But
that more than anything else. It was like you had of course, like the law of blood, but also just, the law of the land, law of blood, law.
But here it's like citizenship is now a piece of paper. It's this other thing.
Well, yeah, it's a desacralized institution in a lot of places, because it's like, well, I'm here now via a piece of paper that says I belong here.
So
and it doesn't really, it's like, well, no, you're not. Like, we all know that.
And that's why it's like, it's this slight alteration to be like, here's a thing that I am, or here's just another attribute. I think that was part of the ship, which is like, I am not just a subject. It's not blood and soil things. Like, I'm an individual with this thing, with this passport, or I have this thing called a job. I am not my job, but I have this thing called a job, which I wear as like a uniform. Like, there's a shift in our understanding of our relationship to both citizenry and job, which is, in a sense, the introduction of an entire new hierarchy. It's a hierarchy within a hierarchy. They think it makes everything lateral and equal, but I don't think that's ever been the case. I think it's just been, a multitudes of hierarchies that people are now defining themselves by. So, and someone had made a good point here where, let me just scroll up. It was an interesting take. It was about how we were trying to like rediscover our work ethic. Let me just see here. Yeah, so this is a Teal Bucks dish. Right? It says maybe people start identifying more with their work post-industrialization, precisely to retain someone's sense of dignity, as opposed to just identifying as part of a wagey hive. That's another interesting take. Like, people sort of
this, you can see this in the Communist Manifesto.
Yeah, so there's lots of going on here, but I think it's more complex and interesting than Osterhammel was, indicating here. You might see a different kind of understanding of the job, but not exactly like he was saying, although I think there's enough truth in there. Anyway, we're spending a lot of time on this, but to me, you can zoom in on this and it tells a much larger story of, what's really going on. Not when we say our understanding of ourselves change. Well, like, draw me a picture of that. What does that look like? Spatialize that for me. What do you mean? Is it because I don't believe in sort of the linear trajectory upward of understanding? It has to be like we didn't just get smarter. That's one way of saying it, but it's like, no, we just, because we'll get into this in a little bit about it was really the dawn of network thinking in terms of networks, and sort of the destruction of that really simplified linearity. So I'm like, we increase the resolution of and nuance of how we understand fucking everything. And in my sense, just it was the proliferation of hierarchies which we can follow up into authors like Martin Gurry, and the realization now that there is no the people, there is no mass, there is no public, there's only publics, these interest groups. And of course that's apparent in a multicultural society just based on ethnicity and race, but even within that, within whites, you start to see sort of this breakdown of silos as well that are just as real, sometimes maybe even more real than their loyalty to their blood, let's say. Did you have? You said you wanted to get to China. I don't want to just.
Oh no. I mean, like if let's focus on the revolution. I kind of mentioned the China thing when we discussed sort of the reaction to catching up to the rest of the world. And also like we can cover China more in depth, or I might do we can do a one-off episode. There's a book called The War in the Heavenly Kingdom that focuses on the Taiping Rebellion that I would like to bring up. It's something that Osterhammel spends a lot of time discussing in passing, despite the fact I think it being one of the most important events for China in the 19th century. But no, let's cover this, the Industrial Revolution, and then I want to really hammer frontiers, and then maybe we can we'll see what we have left for time.
Yeah, there's this part here. Let me get it here. 669. Should have had this up already. Let's scroll. Here we go. This is the part. It says, energy was a leitmotif of the whole century. What had previously been known only as an elemental force, especially in the shape of fire, now became an invisible but efficient power with unsuspected possibilities. The guiding scientific image of the century was no longer the mechanism, as in the early modern age, but the dynamic interrelationship of forces. Other sciences followed along the same path. In fact, political economy had already done this with much greater success than energy theory of culture targeted by Max Weber. After 1870, neoclassical economics suffered from something like physics envy and began to make abundant use of energy images. Ironically, it was just when the energy of animal bodies was losing its significance for economics that the significance of human corporeality became clear. Bodies were seen as necessarily participating in a universe where energy had no boundaries, and, as Helmholtz had shown, did not vanish into thin air. Under the influence of thermodynamics, the still abstract philosophical labor power of classical political economy was replaced with the human motor, which, as a combined muscular nervous system, could fit into planned work processes and whose ratio of energy output to input could be measured experimentally with precision. By mid-century, Karl Marx's concept of labor power was reflecting the impact of Helmholtz's theories, and Max Weber, too, at the beginning of his career, occupied himself in detail with the psychophysics of industrial work. I really like that. I love the growing significance of energy, and not just as a power source, but sort of this ever-present. I was thinking about this just the other day about I don't want to complain about any individual, but I was talking about how retired leftists who started coming up with some kooky philosophical ideas and get really big on Twitter. The thing that always stuck out to me about leftist thinking, because we've discussed anti-Oedipus on the show and a lot of the CCRU stuff, there is a through line there, and it goes back to Marx. In the first few chapters of Capital, he talks about the surplus. And this goes back to what I was just saying about separation, that because surplus within the Industrial Revolution and within the capitalist model is like separated from the labor and the landowner or whatever, and becomes leftists love to separate forces and make them into entities with minds of their own. So it's like the drive to maximize surplus with as little human labor as possible becomes the driving force for the entire job itself. It becomes like its own little hovering creature. And that's what leftists love to do. They love to separate and turn concepts into egregores, and turn, ideas into entire dimensions that you can inhabit, and create these sort of superstructures of thought. And so I noticed with energy, that kind of starts with this. separate, like what is energy. It's not just this thing, it's kind of everywhere, and it's everything, and everything is kind of connected. And so you start, like, political theory and political economy has to try and keep up with science, has to keep up with thermodynamics, has to try and advance. And maybe it doesn't, the desire to advance is perhaps greater than its understanding of itself. Like, so it just starts talking like it's a science when it's not in fact a science. It starts trying to just appropriate terminology that it barely understands, and it's just trying to apprehend these ideas, but like using tools that it's unfamiliar with. But anyway, but I find that to this day, I find that we're still pretending that we understand something more than we do, just because we separate it from something real and give it a scary face and try and act like it's an organism. But what do we really
we do that a
from?
lot, even in our own spaces, where we create we create these sort of internet meme spacey terms to sort of describe older sociological phenomenon, either because we haven't engaged with the literature or we're reinventing the wheel by just slapping on a different, brand of rubber. We do that a lot. I mean, we kind of covered a lot of sociological concepts in the anti-memetics book, but just like, the author of that book, a lot of guys in our spaces, I won't name names because I respect a lot of the work they do, but like they do manage to break down a lot of, sort of conceptual spaces and ideas with very, sociological language that would most often just be associated with, now we're going to use, like, we're going to talk about meme space. We're going to talk about, just like the unknown of like this, like online terminology, just everything that you could imagine. We've created our own language to discuss the very terms that we maybe know, or a sociological concept that we can't really describe all that well. So we're just gonna use our favorite online terminology to describe it. This is why I think in a large degree, like what you're discussing here is like, oh, well, leftists will do this, but also at the same time, where you're using the language that and it's the same thing too with like how English is indigenized. It's also it's onlineified, or whatever you want to call it, memeified, etc. Like, this is just the parlance in which we use to communicate nowadays. And I think that, also to bring it back to the book too, like, one of the things that Osterhammel does that is both interesting, but also infuriating, is that, like, yes, these things come from a very specific people and place, but like, this does not require us to really, we shouldn't be looking at them for the negative, as negative consequences. Like, actually quite a bit of the things that come out of the 19th century, you could argue was good. I'm not saying like socialism or whatever, but it's just like, he's really taking a lot of these things and providing an understanding for like, well, this is how we've come to the modern era, and you have nothing but yourselves conceptually to blame, which I find infuriating. But nevertheless, like, it's important to sort of look at where he's coming from, at least for this, to give the book its fair shake. But overall, I'm just like, okay, this is nothing that I haven't seen before in terms of how the 19th century has been explained to me. Like I said at the last episode, I took a 19th century in Europe college course. Not like that means anything. I'm not like an expert. I'm never going to claim I'm an expert in anything. But like, it was interesting to see that like the themes I'm covering out of this book was no different from the literature I had read when I was in college about like, well, this is the 19th century in Europe. We have the Industrial Revolution, the collapse of the Ancien regime, and also we're really now beginning to look at mass politics and politics as machines, and all things are looked at mechanically. And it's just like, well, I'm not really seeing anything groundbreaking other than Osterhammel's done a good job at sort of covering the impact that these ideas have had on the rest of the world at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, and to me, That's why I almost didn't want to talk about the Industrial Revolution unless it's to set up something else, which is what the consequence of that was. And we talk about, the creation of the real job, which is, what that is what it is. But there's also, I think, more importantly, a focus on how time is kept. And I think it was either Harold Innis or it was
I mean, like that's just in communications and empire.
Yeah.
Like you and I've covered that separately. I mean, you and I've talked about that, like I want to say like 3 years ago on the air.
I think that was like on like a proto Do You Even Read?
Yeah, it was. Like we covered the Canadian duo of McLuhan and Innis. And it was just like what I mean, like the time thing is the most, I think, important one here, because that also relates to other books that we've covered on this show. It's just like, actually, once uniform time comes in, because now we have, systems of keeping time, we have the ability to understand, like, okay, this is where we are on a calendar, on a year. This radically transforms our understanding of industry, the nation, religion, transportation, logistics. This is where the modern empire comes from, because now, like all space-based communications, we're now in an environment where I can constantly be printing out new things, new decrees, new edicts, and build, I don't have to build a memorial. Instead, all I got to do now is just make sure that the newest, thing from the governor's office or this new law is passed mandating the specific policy of like the prime minister or the king or the president. And like those, I think, are kind of what we're doing even now in our own small little spaces. Like it's a public of publics, and it's the same thing on a like micro scale with like Twitter. It's just like, oh, it's a Twitter of Twitters. And when we look at it that way, it's just like, well, we're all reinforcing our own little imperial forms of communication by, oh, well, this new polemic gets shared in the group chat. Like all the decrees have been shared. And he's kind of covering the same stuff here, and it's just like, this isn't anything I haven't really seen. Not a lot of this is groundbreaking. I finished the text. The most interesting stuff for me when I was reading this book really was when he was talking about everything but Europe, because I kind of know the story of the 19th century in Europe. I would like to read more about the 19th century of Europe
Empire,
from different perspectives that are by my own like guys,
And the problem is that he talks quite a bit about Japan. He talks quite a bit about the Ottoman Empire, and we talked about this in the first.
Well, I mean, the Ottoman Empire is important to the entire history of the 19th century, and well, even not just the 19th, but like all of the last 3 centuries in Europe, because its growth, its development. I mean, Constantinople falls in 1453. And since then, the Ottoman Empire greatly expands past the Seljuk Turks, because now it's like it's parts of Greece, it's Bulgaria, it's parts of the Balkans, and it's only just now, I think they were saying it was like Albania or one of these other countries where it's like it's no longer a majority Muslim. And it's just like that's centuries later after conquest. You're kind of looking at like the demographic consequences of that. And it's just like, okay, well, this is the world that kind of stuff is far more interesting to me when I look at the history of Europe and the 19th century as a whole than just say, basic, accepted histories of how things came to be.
No, yeah, absolutely. Sorry, I was just someone was asking me if I'm scared of the spooky Industrial Revolution. I don't know. Maybe we all are.
And its consequences.
I had a whole thing I was going to say, but I was looking at the time, and I wanted to just make sure I get to this, because I didn't want to just leave it at the Industrial Revolution. I wanted to kind of build on that, and then we're just discussing time just there. I just wanted to skip to this one part. If you
sure,
don't
go
mind.
to it.
This is under a subheading that I've just titled Network Thinking. He goes on here, he says, to think in terms of networks was a 19th century development. In the 17th century, the English physician William Harvey discovered the body as a circulatory system, and in the 18th century, the French doctor of physiocratic theorist Francois Quinzenay Queste applied this model to the economy and society. The next stage was the network. In 1838, the politician and scholar Frederick List, who I don't think we've ever discussed, but I covered his book, Political Economy, on the show a long time ago. Take that, Big Ben. Frederick List is brought up. He's pretty cool. Mapped out the railroad web, a national transportation system for the whole of Germany. It was a bold vision of the future. Before 1850, however, it was not possible to speak of a railroad network in any European country. Frederick List proposed the fundamental planning schema, and when the railroads were actually in place, certain critics took up the web image and presented them as a dangerous spider stretched out over its victims. Later, the web came to stand for a way of visualizing a city, competing for a time with the labyrinth, or especially in the United States, with grid. The self-image of societies as networks thus has its roots in the 19th century, even if the full range of meanings up to today's social networks appeared only much later. This is what I was talking about before. We radically shift our conceptualization as time not just being the ocean that we inhabit, but time being full of discrete moments, and those discrete moments being able to be filled with labor, and labor being understood as a type of energy. Getting back to the point we just made, everything becomes about energy. It's something that needs to be expended or harvested, or it's wasted, or if there's time that doesn't have that energy in it, it's wasted time. You can, within this era, you have the birth of the idea of wasting time, which is such a radical new idea that didn't exist throughout history. So you have all these things happening at the same time. And he continues on here. Let me just skip ahead here. So he goes on, he says, for a long time, the growth of the modern world economy was seen in the West as a spreading of links and contacts out from Europe. The memorable image of the phased development of an expansive modern world system, according to Emanuel Wallerstein, also served to encourage this. Today, however, it's more plausible to suppose that the emerging world economy of the 17th and early 18th centuries was polycentric. Several different commercial capitalisms flourished simultaneously in different parts of the world, each associated with the rise of production for distant markets. European trade dominated the Atlantic and, from the middle of the 18th century, pushed back the Asian competition, but it would be too simplistic to envisage the world economy as it was restructured after the 1840s under the aegis of free trade as a single network spanning the globe. The world market is a rather abstract theoretical fiction. Depending on the commodity, many markets grew so large that one might describe them as global, but none of them can be separated from a specific geography. None cover the earth in a geometrically even manner. Now, what do you think about that? Part of me wants to disagree. You know what I mean? Like, are we just quibbling over the definitions? Is it true to say that there was just regional capitalisms springing up, or would it be more true to say that, like the Industrial Revolution, like if we say the Industrial Revolution,
like realizes the importance of a global supply chain? Like, are we just relitigating that, like how important like the mercantilist system was at a time when like now you have like domestic manufacturing at home? I just maybe there's something I'm missing semantically. I don't know, but like like various networks are going to matter, but they also become heavily interlinked as like at the same, like you mentioned this at the beginning, like this isn't just one root cause of everything. Like, yes, now we have the Industrial Revolution, but like also we have a redefinition or an understanding of like the traditional state that's going to like heavily require us to build upon an understanding of the population and a worker. And now we can talk about like concepts such as total war. Like things are going to build off of one each other and they're interlinked, but like this, you could say that like the early modern era prior to the 19th century was like a capitalism of various economies, because like you had sugar plantation farming, you had the Society for Development of Manufacturers, like you had societies that were predicated on how can we build things more effectively, or we looking at have our spies in French ports and shipyards. Like I don't know what I'm getting at here other than like, okay, yes, like supply chains matter. I guess I'm missing something. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm trying to sort of have a demarcation here in time where it's like, of course we had these systems in the past, but maybe once again it's just the awareness of these systems and the self-conceptualization. Like, there were networks in the past.
Like, yeah, our modern conception of the state emerges because nation states are now much more entrenched political entities that seem to have much more stable forms of polity than previous versions. Like, that's what I'm getting out of this, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, like awareness of the hierarchy doesn't destroy the hierarchy; it just shatters the hierarchy into a multitude of smaller hierarchies. We became aware of the network. Of course, there were networks before, but awareness of the network and the proliferation of that awareness multiplied the available networks. And once you start believing the world is a network, so this is sort of the scientific thinking, you think, oh, I found a universal truth, so we must replicate it and apply this to everything. And so you get into, extreme projects like, I know this is what's his name? The guy who wrote Seeing Like a State. You remember, that's a book a lot of people have read, but it shows where these sorts of scientific political projects go wrong, like with scientific forestry, thinking, oh, we can have a network of trees, and a grid of trees, and that destroys the ecosystem. Or we can design the perfect city network. You mentioned that before. Like, we started seeing cities as networks. So the conclusion you very quickly arrive at is we can design a perfect network, design a perfect city. Here will be the sector where people work. Here's the entertainment sector. And guess what? We're going to draw it like Atlantis so everyone's happy. It's going to be a big bunch of concentric fucking circles. Isn't that going to be cool? And then no one wants to live there. Because it turns out no one wants to fucking live in Atlantis. Surprise. Everyone hates this shit when it's done. But these failures show that there was this, emergent trend towards systems. I think it's true. I don't think he's wrong there. And I don't think we've really left that, have we? I think more than ever we tend to think in terms of this is graph theory. This is everything is networks and systems.
This is intersectional.
Yeah, and I think that's just kicked into high gear recently. But I don't think it's not like we didn't have networks before. But I think the obsession with networks started then. Would that be fair to say, or would that even be too far?
The modern conception as we know it, sure.
All right.
Yeah.
And before we, there is one more thing I'd love to get to, and we teased this out last time.
Then I say we get to it, and we'll see where we want to do from there.
Because I feel like we need to get a bit more to the nation state. And we mentioned this a bit in the last episode, but there's a lot I didn't get to cover here. I just thought I could read a little bit here.
Yeah, go for it.
He says, German and French historians in particular consider the 19th century as the age of nationalism and nation states. And again, this leads right from what we were talking about, which was network theory, thinking in terms of networks. How can the people who are now living in a realm of shattered hierarchies and can start to conceptualize themselves a bit differently, how can you have something like a nation? And I wrote about this in the Vanguard's journal article that it seemed in the 19th century that nationalist movements existed within monarchies and within empires and other civilizations. So the idea was it had to be a network within a network. You didn't really see these emerge outside of civilizations. Then you would just have a tribe, I suppose. There's a colony that's like a transplanted network. It's a different node of a larger network. But there was this idea that what does it mean to be a people within this larger system, but you still are apart from it? That's kind of an interesting idea that probably it didn't achieve prominence as strongly as this in the past. And I'll keep going here. He says, The Franco-Prussian War was a conflict between one of the oldest European nation states and a neighbor seeking to measure up and outmaneuver the land of revolutions. Theirs were entangled histories, if any in Europe can be described as such, not between fundamentally unequal partners, but within a constellation that would, in the very long run, lead to the post-1945 equilibrium. But can the Franco-German perspective sustain an interpretation of Europe or even the world in the 19th century? British historiography, without the resonance of Reichsgründung, had for German historians seldom placed so much emphasis on the process of nation-state formation, seeing the founding of the Reich as a German affair with implications for the rest of Europe. The British Empire, by contrast, did not owe its existence to any founding event, except perhaps for those who wish to glorify a couple of buccaneers from the Elizabethan age. It had not come about in a big bang that had developed through a complex and lengthy process in many world theaters, with no overall direction from the center. Britain, unlike Germany, did not need to found an empire in the 19th century because for a long time it already possessed one whose origins cannot be precisely established. I think I might even, I'm not sure I agree with that. You know, like what are we talking about, the British Empire, or are we talk as a new construct? But you tell me like the English didn't understand themselves. They didn't have, not long ago we discussed the history of the kings of Britain written by Geoffrey of Monmouth. I'm like, I mean, the story of Britain mythology, the founding mythology of Britain is pretty well established, is it not? I mean, you and I aren't British, but just say that Britain just didn't have a founding. Doesn't sound right, does it? Or it's just like a semantic thing again.
I don't. To me, this reads like get this continental gibberish out of here. I don't know. You and I are we live in the nations that are the descendants of an Anglo system. I have a deep love for England by nature of just my ancestry, and I don't know. Maybe I'm just a big old Anglophile. I don't know by that happenstance, but like that description and comparison and contrast of self just feels very. It's foreign to me. Is the only way I really can describe it, because it feels radically. It just doesn't pass the smell test for me. And at the same time, I'm just thinking to myself, okay, well, if that's the case, then, England has a pretty both ancient and modern conceptualization of itself that we can all kind of trace to, whether it's the Kings of England, Arthurian legend, the tales of its explorers, its maritime heroes as well. Like, it just feels very like I don't know where this guy's coming from on that regard. Whereas you're also comparing, again, I think it's just the classic, like, this is the continent versus like the Anglo understanding of self again.
Oh, sorry. A wingman says capitalism does not equal free trade. That's how you and I might view it. Who doesn't view it that way is Marxists.
The author.
Like any Marxist that tell like everything's pretty much capitalism. We got to this in Anti-Oedipus. Like if you read these theorists, especially throughout the 20th century, they really expanded the definition of what capitalism is to be all hierarchy and all power processes, up to and including sexual dynamics and everything. So they would say all trade is basic, unless it's some kind of anarchistic barter system. But even then, they really drill down into human psychology, which must be reworked. So I agree with you, but understand that the types of people who talk about capitalism the most, they probably would view all trade networks as, capitalistic in one form or another. But that's just who gives a shit about that? So he just continues on here. Let me just get to this before I go, because I still do agree that the 19th century is pivotal in the history of nationalist thought. Whereas before we had tribes, we had groups of people, we had countries, we had empires and stuff. But what I was most fascinated in was nationalist movements within nations. The idea that, you could have these sort of breakaway nations. You can have, anyway, just a people within the people that create such a problem for the monarchy that they new emergent hierarchies threatening existing hierarchies, but not threatening hierarchy as such. So he continues on here. He says, let me just skip ahead here. 428. 428. So he says, can it be said that all of these new political structures were nation states in an internal sense? There's reason to doubt it. After 100 years of existence as a state, Haiti had to show for itself a questionable past and a deplorable present. Neither its political institution building nor its socioeconomic development had made much progress. In mainland South and Central America, the first half of the century after independence was not one of calm consolidation. Most countries achieved political stability only in that crucial decade of the 1870s, which all over the world saw a centralization and reorganization of state power. Greece was at first subject to Bavarian tutelage. The great power seconded Prince Otto, the son of Ludwig I of Bavaria, to reign as monarch. The country then experienced its first coup d'etat under Liberal Prime Minister, I'm not going to say that, Zibazab. Even Belgium was no model nation state. Its dominant nationalism, taking a clear distance from the Netherlands, rooted French in the constitution as the only official language. But from the 1840s, it came under challenge from an ethno-linguistic Flemish nationalism. All this points to the simple conclusion that the 20th century was the great epoch of the nation state. In the 19th century world, empire remained the dominant territorial form of the organizational power. And that's really what when I was saying that it was like the birth of this idea of nationalist struggle, but it wasn't the ascension of the nation state to, the dominant form on earth. But I was more interested in, like we said, with network thinking. I guess you had nationalist thinking. And sort of, and I hate to use the word populist, but it's something different than that. Because with populism, I still think it relies on this belief as this mass of individuals that can operate almost just as a market, and that it will divine what is best for itself. And I think we all disagree that that's the way it goes. But with nationalist thinking, there's like the separation into we can form publics. Like I said, it's a separation of the mass, which goes counter to all of the prevailing liberal ideology and indeed the socialist ideology. And this is why they're in conflict, because I think with socialism you have, and I'm not just trying to complain about socialism here, but there's this idea that it is practical, it is pragmatic, it's mostly about the allocation of resources to alleviate suffering, and there's a lot of theory behind it, but you can't have like a global socialism. So you have the birth of like socialist theory, but then along with this interesting emergent shattering of hierarchies, it's like, well, that's where you get national socialism. Basically, you get this, okay, we can have socialism for this one group, but it doesn't make sense to have it for all these other groups. And so that's why, hey, I know we got a few fans of National Socialism in the audience, so they might agree with that. So are you still there? I'm just...
I'm here. I'm listening.
Well, someone said, was that your goal on Saturday Dimes? I'm not sure. I guess it means the event. But I don't know exactly. It was Oh no, about the kind of, yeah, actually that was that's part of what my speech was about on Saturday. I wasn't directly referencing this, but I just dropped a pretty long video today called How to Make a Canadian People. And more than anything, I don't even think I mentioned Osterhammel in it. I mentioned a few other authors that'll be familiar to people. I do mention Martin Gurry and Niall Ferguson. I tried to use a pretty diverse set of references, but it was basically how to trigger an ethnogenesis on a small scale in the 21st century. So it would be leveraging a lot of this thinking and just seeing, is it possible? And, because this, when it comes to even ethnic or racial identity, I think people might even be thinking too large. And I am friendly to the Samuel Huntington view of, the global conflict having taken a step up from just nation states into more identity-based blocks, and this is where you get the idea of a race war. This is where you get global Islam, and then maybe there's, you see various Eurasian movements there, but you actually, it's not limited to national boundaries. It's more about a conglomeration of ethnicities and really race, but then also, backing away from that and drilling down into the smaller stuff. It's like, can you really rely on that on the ground level? Like if you're a white person and you're interested in advocating for your identity, have you noticed that most of your immediate opponents to that tend to be other white people? And they will not only stand in your way, but they will try and jam you up as much as possible. You lose friends and family over it. So when you talk about your co-ethnics, like how many of them are your enemies? So do you need to do something apart from even them just to survive? Because they seem to have a generational drive towards their own self-destruction and dispossession, politically, genetically, by any measure you can think of. So what can you do over here? And then you can say parallel societies. You can say breakaway civilization. There's all kinds of different fucking ways to say it. But that's more or less what we're talking about. Like what can you do to utilize a genetic bottleneck? And going back to what we mentioned at this very start with the birth rate decline, you're seeing a total population collapse across the world. And that's why I found this book interesting, because there's a lot of, overlapping phenomena here. But there's this idea that, not everyone is going to die, basically. I think if you look into the statistics, and I think we might even talk about this on a previous episode, you see, white birth rates are declining. But if you sort of expand that out, you'll see certain subsets of white people are actually having more kids than ever before. And I think it would have been, I wasn't trying to correlate it with political leanings, but it was like, more educated whites, younger whites. They're having like 5-6 kids. And you're seeing a complete reversal of what we would have assumed, which is that rural people have like low education. I don't want to say low IQ, but, not post-secondary educated rural whites. They used to have the most kids. Now they're having some of the least. But you're getting like college educated yuppies having the most kids. That's interesting. These are the people going to pronatal conferences. That's also interesting. And they're having kids not just because they want to fuck a hole or something, which is what drives a lot of these other groups, but they're doing it for values-based reasons, or they want to. It's about legacy. It's about they take a eugenic mindset. They won't call it that, but that's how they're looking at it themselves. And a lot of people in our space are the same way, but I'm like, that's interesting. These people are going to make it through the eugenic bottleneck here. But yeah, so anyway, I've been going off for a while now, and we need to get going soon. Did you have any closing thoughts about this book? We were a bit more critical this time.
Yeah, I mean, like the first section we used as sort of a conceptual thing to sort of jump off of more than anything else, which I'm perfectly fine with. I think we had a very good discussion. This one, the more I read this, the more I was interested in the histories that came not from Europe itself that he was really discussing, because a lot of his stuff, I felt like I was like, okay, I've seen this all before. Whereas, the stuff on, the rest of the world reacting to like the European development was more up my alley. So, I mean, I don't know if this warrants a part 3. I mean, probably just to cover the last sections. There's things I want to kind of cover and get into it, which we can probably do like next week or depending on what our schedules allow for, because the next one will also be quick and easy. I just know that my schedule is about to like radically change starting next Monday. So I don't know. We'll see what happens.
Sorry, I was muted. What's going on in your life? Any news?
No, I'm taking some classes online that I need to.
He's reading even more on the side.
I am. I signed up for a program over at St. Vladimir's, so I kind of have to get some. I have to take care of that because I paid money to go do that. So yeah, I'll be busy.
I think we're taking shit in the comments for not recommending reading Mao. What's this? It's always a guerrilla war, and the entire thing of reading leftist shit. I don't see them suggesting to read anything about Mao. He said, the one guy who can say he faced down impossible odds and beat the House. Very interesting omission for dissidents. We could read some fucking Mao.
Yeah, I don't really have a problem with that.
You want me to read a Chinese guy? Okay, buddy.
I've read Chinese fiction. I haven't read. It's funny. I have not read Mao. I've read a lot of stuff on, like I mentioned, the War in the Heavenly Kingdom earlier, because I find the Taiping Rebellion to be like a really interesting part of world history that no one fucking talks about.
We already read the how Europe underdeveloped Africa. So if we do Mao,
yeah, that's from an African guy. Like,
here's what your leftism will look like if it was black and Chinese.
That's right. We can do black and Chinese leftism. I don't have a problem with that.
It says that wasn't directed at you guys. I was being vague for a reason. What's wrong?
These boomer vague posters.
What's wrong? What's wrong, vague boy? Afraid you might say something? What's okay? I haven't seen this before. Maybe I just absorbed it, but it's like vaguey, get in. Where would he be getting into? Like wagey, getting cagey. Where's the vaguey getting into?
Well, he's not getting in anything because he's not being fucking specific.
I gotta work on this. I can't workshop this live. I'm too tired. But I got something on the line here, friend.
He's got ideas. He's cooking.
All right. So, Autumn in the Heavenly Kingdom.
War in the Heavenly Kingdom is what the book's called. It's an interesting little history on the Taiping Rebellion. I enjoyed it. I remember recommending it to my audience like several years ago. I'd have to reread it, but I think it's held up.
We got one here from Chris Hassler. Will you consider doing a dire episode on ethnogenesis and the biosphere by Lev Gumilev? I think I read someone, probably him, ask this question in another comment. So
I know he asked on Twitter. I mean, maybe if time permits. I know that we more or less have the next 6 months of books ready to go, but we can always add it to the list. And depending on how fast of a read it is, then, we might just cover it. You never know.
I just saw that name. I'm thinking, is that Lev guy that Geo knew?
No. His last name is Polyakov.
Okay. Another one that ends in V. Interesting. Another Lev with a fucked up last name. Coincidence?
I think not.
Oh, I'm going to start calling people vague slaves. I like that. So
I like that too, vague slaves.
All right. Just to conclude here, what do I think about the book? Like you had said, I like the first half a bit more. I think that was your conclusion when we were first talking about this. You love the first half.
The first half of this book is particularly interesting to me.
And I liked the scope. I like the ambition behind the book. There's a great many things I think are true. There's some parts where I think he might be reaching, and that might be his ideological bias showing. I think like books like Guns, Germs, and Steel. Like Guns, I would relate to that because that was trying to take a scientific approach and apply it globally across all of time. Say this is how the world got to where it is, and here's the model for that. But I think within that you'll find some interesting stuff. Like we said, we didn't really get too much into, talking about what was going on between China and Japan. If you're into history, I think there's enough here. It's well over 1,000 pages. You'll find enough here to keep you interested. And he does,
There's a lovely bibliography at the end that you can happily rely on to get more direct sources, both primary and secondary, on any of the sections of history of the 19th century that you might be interested in.
Yeah, but I think overall I liked it. Overall, I think the real central pillars of the theme about the way the century thought about itself, like what ideas were emerging then, which we are still reckoning with, and which ones have mutated throughout the 20th and 21st century. So I think I've been pretty clear about the stuff I like and the stuff I don't like, so I don't need to just relitigate that. But I hope people enjoyed it. I don't even know if we necessarily need a third one or if we'll just sort of fold that into future episodes, because I'm sure they'll come up. I mean, we're still reckoning with spinal catastrophism to this day.
Yeah, but I mean, I don't know. I may cover it on my own, or at least the frontier section, because I have some things that I kind of want to chew on and take issue with. But we'll see.
Of Nanking.
What?
The vague of Nanking instead of
The
the
vague of Nanking. Oh boy, that'll do it.
Yeah. All right. So we'll let everyone go, and we got some very exciting ideas for the next few books.
Oh yeah, it's gonna be a fun time.
All right. Thank you so much, Brood, for taking the time, and we'll see you all next.